During the first round of the NFL draft, the Philadelphia Eagles have always given us some crazy reactions, for better or worse. What would our initial reactions be in certain scenarios on day one in 2024? We'll get into that and more coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles.
You are Locked On Eagles, your daily Philadelphia Eagles podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
What's up, Eagles fans? I'm Louie DiBiase, co-host of the Locked On Eagles podcast. You can find my work also over at Bleacher Report. He's Gino Camilleri, my co-host, another analyst for Bleacher Report, and our scouting director on today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. What would our initial reactions be on draft night if the Eagles do certain things with their first pick at 22nd overall, trading up, trading down? We're going to get into that. Plus, will Howie Roseman dive back into the pool of Georgia and Alabama prospects this year? And our favorite draft classes on paper since Howie has been the GM again in 2016 and on. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Today's episode is brought to you by GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, use our code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. So yeah, Gino, I thought about this talking to some other Locked On guys and thinking about our live show and just some of the crazy reactions we've had, for better or worse. Like, we both were in love with the Devontae Smith pick. The A.J. Brown trade was iconic. Moving up for Jalen Carter. Most of the time we've been pretty happy, but there's been some times that we were scratching our heads, maybe me more than you, the Landon Dickerson pick, or I can remember Milton Williams even. Pretty much anytime they take a lineman for me. So for better or worse, most of the time it's been positive, but they've never really done anything boring, even like the Jalen Reagor pick, of course, in 2020. So I laid out some scenarios for you on day one we'll go through. And I want to get your initial reaction if the Eagles take these routes, because it's kind of been the theme of the last few weeks for our podcast. And again, the reactions, it always just feels like they're extreme. We're never just like, okay, like, yeah, that makes sense.
A lot of the time. I mean,
like the Dillard pick maybe is the only one. I mean, I don't know.
This time of year, you have to remember that the guys inside the building know way better than we do. And you can go back and there's some ugly draft reactions from me. And me and Lou were talking about this the other day, that there's some great ones and some ones that I kind of bite my tongue on a little bit. Like Dexter Lawrence, like I said, he was just a run defending interior defensive lineman when the Giants took him.
Me making fun of the Lions draft class last year. I mean, yeah, there's a lot of them.
I think a lot of people, including Rick Spielman and Mike Zimmer on that call, were making fun of the Eagles when they took Justin Jefferson, and you and I were on a live chat with each other saying how excited we were that the pick was Jalen Reagor. So at the end of the day, the reaction at first, it's great to get clicks. It's great for the interaction, but remember, you can't grade these trades, quote unquote, or picks until 3 years down the road, more than likely.
Right.
I mean, you're still trying to figure out what is Jordan Davis, and he was selected.
Cam Jurgens too, even.
Same thing, and that's the evaluation process. So come draft night, there are some scenarios where I think you and I will probably be a little somber in a mood, and
I think everybody knows what he's alluding to.
Joyous, and there are some moves that will keep us on the edge of our seat, and Howie Roseman has been known to do both, man. And I just want to tell a quick story on this one before we really get into it, that the ultimate bad draft reaction I've ever had that came true was in 2015, the Marcus Smith draft. I was in college.
Or 2014, right?
2014, rather, with my college roommate, Alex White, shout out. He's a Washington Commanders fan. He goes, Gino, how mad would you be if the Eagles took a linebacker? I said, there's absolutely no chance they're taking a linebacker tonight. Everything plays out, and all you see when that graphic hits is linebacker Marcus Smith, and I died inside. I was dead as an Eagles fan.
That might be the only pick I had no hope for at all, because I remember doing a mock draft for the blog I wrote for back then, and that was in high school, and I had Marcus Smith going to the Eagles in the third round. So there's been other picks I've been able to talk myself into, even if they're linemen, Gino. Like the Andre Dillard pick was not one I was super happy with, but I eventually got there with the logic.
We rationed our way into it. Yeah,
Marcus Smith might be the only one I never rationalized, and that I think is a good thing. But that's why this segment, I labeled it initial thoughts for draft day, because as you said, the evaluation process is ever changing for sure. But I want to get your thoughts on if the Eagles take this route, what would be your reaction on our live show? So I came up with 5 scenarios I want to get into. And the number one scenario is one that we've talked about before, and I think people kind of know how we would think. But, Gino, if the Eagles trade up for an offensive tackle in the first round, your initial thought is?
Who is it, and what's the price?
Okay, let's say your top prospect at the offensive tackle position. That's not Joe Alt, because I don't think he's in striking distance. Anybody else pick of the litter, and they don't give up. They give up maybe a second-round pick and some futures.
Let's say Jeff Stoutland, he made googly eyes at Troy Fautanu at the draft.
Which is probably the guy.
They're in love with this guy. I go back to the Andre Dillard type of night where it's like, I completely understand the pick. It makes a lot of sense, especially with Fautanu, that he could potentially kick into guard and challenge Tyler Steen. But on the other end of the sword, when is Tyler Steen going to see the field? He's a second-round pick. Was it really worth it if Lane Johnson is going to pull a Jason Kelsey or a Jason Peters, which
play another 3 years
before? And there was a graph that came out, and I can't remember exactly who it was, but it was how much draft ammo was spent on offensive line talent over X amount of years. And the Eagles were right in the middle of the pack. And if you think about it, it's because of Jeff Stoutland. It's because you have this coach that's able to do these insane things with guys like Isaac Seumalo and Big V and Jordan Mailata, where we come to draft night and we're saying, well, yeah, he's not going to see the field for 3 years, but it's an Eagles pick all in all.
Well, and that's why I labeled, for me, I said my first reaction would be this is overkill, but not from an offensive tackle perspective, just overall trenches in general. And as you mentioned, Gino, there isn't a guarantee that you're going to need this player in a year or two. So I don't know. And this isn't the scenario of they just sit there at 22 and take Tyler Guyton from Oklahoma. It's they trade up for an offensive tackle. They be aggressive to continue this strategy that they've taken in the draft.
Give up a third at minimum to get up there.
Yeah, right? I think it's going to take that.
16 to get up with Seattle, more than likely.
Unless you're moving up only like a spot or two to guarantee you get your pick of Guyton or Mims or one of the other ones that fall from like the Pac-12. Yeah, for me, overall, that would be overkill. Maybe, again, not for tackle specifically, but for the trenches. Here's another one. I want to stick with trenches before I get into some other positions. Gino, the Eagles draft a defensive tackle in the first round. What would your initial reaction be on the live show?
Once again, who is it? But I also believe you're probably getting a better player at that position, at a position rather that you have a bigger need than edge, in my opinion, where if you're going to add a Byron Murphy to this team, right? You just lost Fletcher Cox. Who's the next up after Jalen Carter? I mean, the incumbent is probably Milton Williams, right? But he has no contract extension right now. And
he hasn't fully broken out yet either, Gino. Like Milton's been flashing for 3 years, but there's no guarantee he's your top 2 or 3 guys.
I mean, look at when they signed Javon Hargrave a couple of years ago, or even going back to Michael Bennett. Like, they like to have 2 premier guys on the inside. I mean, they did it with Timmy Jernigan. They tried to do it with Malik Jackson. I mentioned Michael Bennett they brought into that area as well. Yep. It would make so much sense. And at edge, unless you're giving me Jared Verse, I would take Byron Murphy. I think he would be a pick and somebody that's probably going to be on the board at
We're on the same page with that, actually. Honestly, of the 3 trench positions, or 4, you should say, for me, defensive tackle might be the one I would be the most on board with, especially if it's Murphy from Texas. That would be my favorite pick.
Johnny Newton I probably would be on board with as well.
Yeah,
I mean, it makes a lot of sense. Like, it's a position that the Eagles, they love to draft. They love to have multiple
2 first-round picks the last 2 years and a third-rounder in the last 3 drafts.
Surefire guys. I mean, separate Jordan Davis. He's more of that 0-1 tech that's going to play in front of the center and the guard. What Jalen Carter does, he is going to go after the quarterback. He is trying to beat his one-on-one. And if he gets doubled, well, he's got to have somebody on the other side that can win their one-on-one on the interior. So,
and that's where my initial reaction would be, Gino, actually, I don't think they trust Jordan Davis to be a 3-down player if they're drafting a tackle in the first round.
And with edge, there's so much youth there to where you legitimately have 3 guys that are under 26 years old with Josh Sweat, who's, dude, I can't believe he's not even 27 years old yet.
No, he's only 26 right now.
That's insane. I feel like he's been playing for a decade at this point. And you have him and Nolan Smith and Bryce Huff and who knows what Vic Fangio really wants in that position. One thing that any defensive coordinator can use is gap penetrating interior defensive linemen like a Johnny Newton, like a Byron Murphy. And if Jordan Davis and Milton Williams are not in the future plans, and let's say 2 years from now, you're going to have to bring in some legitimately capable players,
right,
not just guys that are like a Marlon Tuipulotu and a Moro Ojomo, that if you do hit on them, it's a benefit, but you know what they are in the picks.
All right, I want to go to corner here. So, Gino, I did one before the draft. The Eagles trade for, because they've done, right before the draft, they've made trades like you saw with the New Orleans Saints a few years ago. Didn't involve a player. But let's say the Eagles make an A.J. Brown-like trade before the draft. So they trade for a corner before the draft. My initial reaction would be that I think either A, they don't think they can get up for Quinyon Mitchell or Terrion Arnold, and B, they might be really gunning for an offensive lineman on day one. If they go out there and spend like a day 2 pick on a Greg Newsome or a J.C. Horn, I think that means either A, they want to tackle on day 1, or B, or both, they don't think they can get one of those top 2 prospects in striking distance.
I was going through this exercise today in my head that if you really look at the positions that teams are willing to take premier, and I'm talking like top 1 through 10 picks on, it's going to be quarterback, it's going to be offensive line, and you've seen over the last 5 years or so, dude, cornerbacks are going like crazy.
Yeah. I mean, Witherspoon's a top 5 pick last year, and
I don't think many people were expecting that, right?
I wasn't.
In that class, you're saying there's multiple guys that are probably going to go, but Devon Witherspoon, he's probably a top 15 guy.
Who thought Emmanuel Forbes was going to be a top 16 pick?
Dude, I mean, even look at Derek Stingley going at number 3, Sauce Gardner, the same thing. Teams are valuing these top-level corners. So I'm with you. It means that, 1, they're probably going to replace James Bradbury at this point. 2, they don't believe that they have somebody that they can draft that is going to step onto the field right away. It might be, let's say, a Kool-Aid McKinstry type of situation. He stepped in, and he's more of a rotational player at first, might take a couple years to develop. If you're bringing in Greg Newsome, the guy is going to go and start at that position, right? And it's going to be for probably multiple years if you want to extend him, and he might transition into that number 1. But at the same time, it doesn't stop them from adding talent in the draft. I would say it stops them from adding one in the first 2 days, but on day 3, when they have multiple picks, they'll probably take 1 or 2 guys at that position. All
right, Gino, last scenario for you. The Eagles draft a wide receiver or tight end on day 1, or let's say with that 50th pick in the 2nd round. What's your initial reaction?
Depending on the player, I think I would be pretty happy with it. When I was running through mocks before we did our mock versus mock, there was a lot of times when a player like Ben Sinnott is sitting there, and he legitimately is a top tight end in this class outside of Brock Bowers, according to a lot of people. And in my opinion, I know you love JT Sanders. I'm a Ben Sinnott fan myself, so like I would love that pick. And if you're talking about, would Jalen Polk be a little bit rich for my blood, or like a Roman Wilson be a little bit rich for my blood? Absolutely. But if you're talking like Troy Franklin potentially coming in as being your number 3 pick after you have, let's say, already drafted an offensive lineman at this point, you're only adding to that offensive weaponry that you already have. You know that we talked about this the other day. This team is going to overinvest on the offense, underinvest on the defense. Who's to say they wouldn't take multiple picks on offense? It could be offensive line, wide receiver, and I probably wouldn't even bat an eye, or tight end, because they did the same thing with Dallas Goedert. They've done the same thing with top level. I mean, Zach Ertz being replaced by Dallas Goedert, and they've done the same thing with guys like Jason Kelsey and Peters. They will draft your replacement if you were on the team.
That's what crept in my head, Gino, was originally my thought was they're just going to keep going in on offense, and they're going to do the luxury pick and try to just be as deep as you can be for as long as possible before you got to pay all these guys. And I think that would be true if you take like an Xavier Worthy or a Sennett or a Sanders on day 2. But what if they go for, I don't know, like just a more complete player at receiver, like you said, a Troy Franklin or Xavier Leggett from South Carolina, or like if Brian Thomas somehow was instructed. Then I started to think
the whole conversation,
right? And or if it's like Brock Bowers, then my thought went to, do they not think the Smith, Goddard, Brown trio is together long-term, is one out the door in a year or 2? I mean, I don't think that would be true, but if depending on the move
for Philadelphia. I'm going to say that right now.
And I think Devontae would get extended, but if they went up and like took a Brian Thomas, a little part of me would be like, are they not going to pay two guys $25+ million a year?
But if you're sitting at 50 and Xavier Worthy, like,
see, that's different.
You take that guy and it's not even a conversation, right? Like, that's
for sure.
Or like AD Mitchell, like if he's somehow on the board, I don't care where you put him on the field.
But if they like trade up for Brock Bowers, Gino, you're right.
If they're making any move for any offensive playmaker
in an aggressive way,
yeah, look at what they did with Dallas Goedert. Not only did they trade back out of the first round, people forget that they then moved up. To jump ahead of the Dallas Cowboys to get Dallas Goedert. So it could be very indicative. And Howie Roseman writes the script. You just have to kind of sift through the weeds to see what he's doing.
For sure. I can't wait for the live show because no matter what, the reactions are always great. And whichever scenario plays out, it's going to be entertaining for sure. In the past few drafts, it's been a lot of Alabama prospects to react to and Georgia guys. Is Howie Roseman going to take that avenue again? We'll get into it coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast. Today's episode of the Locked On Eagles podcast, we're brought to you today by BetterHelp Online Therapy. You know, a lot of us spend our lives wishing we had more time. For me, it's to do mock drafts and things like this, podcasting. The question is, for you, time for what? If time was unlimited, how would you use it? The best way to squeeze that special thing into your schedule is to know what's important to you and to make it a priority. Therapy can help you find that, what matters to you, so you can do more of it. If you're thinking of starting therapy, give BetterHelp a try. It's entirely online, designed to be convenient, flexible, and suited to your schedule. Just fill out a brief questionnaire to get matched with a licensed therapist, and you can switch at any time for no additional charge. Learn to make time for what makes you happy through BetterHelp. Visit BetterHelp.com/lockedon today. You're going to get 10% off your first month of online therapy. Once again, that's BetterHelp.com/lockedon for 10% off your first month of online therapy. Thanks so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. Guys, are you watching Fox Sports or ESPN on your TV and you got to turn down the volume because of all the shouting? Make the switch to Locked On Sports today. It's a free 24/7 sports streaming channel program for you every day to bring you the biggest stories without all the screaming. Locked On Sports today brings you can't-miss analysis, opinions, and news streaming 24/7 on YouTube or the free Amazon Fire TV channels app. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. So, Gino, you did this a really awesome show about a few weeks ago, getting ready for March Madness, did a bracket of if the Eagles double dip at certain schools, like what are those schools this year that it would be worth it? Because the last few drafts, Howie Roseman finally decided to say, I'm going to take the best players from the best schools, because he didn't do that for a long time. So he took a bunch of kids from Georgia, a bunch of guys from Alabama, and he's been doing better in drafting since he's had that strategy. I want to ask you, because I feel like when we've done our mock drafts, I don't know, this year compared to the last few drafts, there really hasn't been as much of a Georgia bias or Alabama. Do you think, in the early rounds, he's going to keep that theme going?
I think the one theme that you can rely on is he's going to try his hardest, Howie Roseman's hardest, to focus on Power 5 football players. I think that is the priority. And you could save the later rounds for those guys that go under the radar, right? But in the beginning, I think there is going to be a bias towards those type of players. But unless there's a Quinyon Mitchell that you can go and trade up for that does play at a Toledo in the MAC, Howie Roseman would go and do that. And that wouldn't be a thing that just Howie Roseman would do. But if we're getting to the point of focusing on just one school in particular, there isn't just one outlier school where it's like, yeah, every guy would make sense for the Philadelphia Eagles, but there are some darn good ones, man. We talk about the Texas guys all the time between Xavier Worthy and AD Mitchell, and you talk about Byron Murphy, and I'll leave the other interior defensive lineman because he has some off-field issues that you'll get into, but there are schools out there, man, like Michigan. I mean, not as top heavy, but in the middle of the pack. Like if you walked away with Roman Wilson and Mike how do you pronounce
Sainstrill?
Sainstrill? Dude, I need to look at the media guide for that one. I've had trouble all year long. And Junior Colson at linebacker, and like Chris Jenkins on the interior of the defensive line, and even Blake Corum is like another running back behind Saquon Barkley, like that's a pretty good group you're talking about there, Lou. And I mean, what about Penn State? You draft all Penn State guys. Like there's a ton of good ones between Theo Johnson and Olu Fashanu, Chop Robinson, Adiza Isaac. I mean, these big level schools do a great job, one, recruiting, two, if they don't have the talent, finding guys that are NFL level players and bringing them in. Like Oregon, for example, you said on the show the other day that Kyrie Jackson, the cornerback, was down in Alabama, and he transfers up to Oregon. He's still an NFL level player, but teams in the Power Five now in the NIL world, they have the budget to go and get a collection of 6-7 draft prospects in any senior class at this point. So hats off to them.
I think Howie has done a good job of identifying, like you said, I mean, he's kept it more simple. Like, take the best players from the best schools, and you're just the law of averages, or I should say, just the probability. It's going to be better for you. Like, normally those prospects are better overall. Not to say smaller school guys don't work out, because a lot of them do, but I feel like he really has, I don't want to say like he said these past few years, it's Bama and Georgia, because as you mentioned, it could be Michigan or LSU or just Power 5 schools. But I don't know. I will say the last 2 years, it does really feel like with Georgia especially, it's almost like he wanted to take that historically great defense from that school and just bring it to his team, because he went all in with Jordan Davis, Jalen Carter, Nolan Smith, Nakobe Dean, 5 of the starters with Keely Ringo too. This year, I don't think, looking at the prospects from those two schools, like Georgia especially, I don't know, I could see them maybe take Ladd McConkey or Brock Bowers, Kamari Lassiter in the second round's not getting as much hype as maybe he deserves, the corner from Georgia, but I don't think there's just an obvious choice from that school this year like there has been the last 2 years that makes sense from a need, positional, and school perspective.
If you look at Alabama, I think defensively,
that makes more sense.
It's like you could bring in 5 guys that legitimately could be at worst rotational level players.
Odds are closer to Bama being the heavy favorite this year for the Eagles than Georgia.
Right.
Because like you said, both corners you could take.
Yeah, both corners, J.C. Latham right away, and then you take both of the edge rushers.
Like if Dallas Turner fell somehow.
Chris Braswell's probably the worst prospect of that group, and he's still a top 75 guy all day long. So I don't think there will be that evident, like, oh, Georgia won 2 national championships, we should go and target every single player that they have. Because was there that beast of a team this year? I would say no. I mean, Michigan was very, very good, right? But they don't have, I would say, top 30 level defensive players like they did when they had Aiden Hutchinson a couple years ago, right? I mean, as good as a guy like Marshawn Nealand, Marshawn Nealand is Western Michigan. Why do I have him on this Michigan list? But Mike Saintstroll, Roman Wilson, and Chris Jenkins and Junior Colson, those are middle of the pack where we say the difference between player 30 and player 65. Like, what's the difference? That's where those guys are, right? But Bama, you're talking about first round. Washington, not for Philadelphia's needs, but if I'm a team like Chicago or the New York Giants that needs a whole bunch of, if you're going to tell me that
you need offensive help, it's
if the Giants could take Rome Odunze, Jalen Polk, Jalen McMillan, and you add Michael Penix in there as well, and then you add
better than their offense now.
Dylan Johnson, their running back, they're going to be a legitimately better team, and that's a great exercise for a team like that, and that's what we were doing with Georgia last year. But this year, Lou, there's not one team where I'm going to say that they're evidently targeting those guys, because when we were looking at last year's class, it was evident that we wanted Nolan Smith, and we had this outlier chance that Jalen Carter was going to be available. Well, they got both of those guys because they needed both of those guys, in all honesty. Look at what Nolan Smith is. Is he arguably now your number 2B edge rusher at this point? And Jalen Carter is your best defensive lineman, so that's not really the worst thing that you could have done in that department. But if you're going to go and target any team, I say Alabama, just because of the positions. You double dip at edge, you double dip at cornerback, you take an offensive lineman. I don't think there's any chance that you get all of those. There's like 0% chance you get all of those guys. There's some other teams that you can make the argument.
That's the crazy part, man, is like the fact that they were able to, and again, the jury's still out.
All of them is insane.
Yeah, like the jury's still out on 4/5 of them, right? Jalen Carter's the only guy I feel like has been guaranteed to be a hit. We still got to see what Jordan Davis can do as a 3-down player. Nolan Smith, Jacoby Dean's got to stay healthy so he can play. Keely Ringo is not a starter. But the fact that they were able to grab almost half of that entire starting lineup for one of the best college defenses ever is kind of insane when you think about it. Because as you just mentioned, like you look at Bama's team right now, there's no chance the Eagles, and it's one draft class versus 2 or 3, but it's still kind of insane.
As your old elementary gym teacher probably told you when he was teaching you how to shoot a basketball, KISS, keep it simple, stupid. Like there's not one team that you could do it with this year where it was evident the last 2 years with Georgia, right, Lou, where you're saying these guys are so freaking unbelievable. Even Jordan Davis, like make the argument of the production that you want. He's still a unicorn at his position, and the process of why you took him made a bunch of sense. But the actual percentage chance of that actually playing out and to land all of them, even the best gamblers in Vegas would never bet those out.
I will say, Gino, if they go like Kamari Lassiter, they trade down to like 30 and take him and then go Javon Bullard in the second round, then I'm going to be like, okay, Howie's doing this totally on purpose.
He just stopped scouting those schools. I could say he sends guys everywhere. He's very good at his job, but they can't just think that's going to work all. Even with the guys they have. Are you surefire to land all of them being starters for you going forward? I mean, what is Jordan Davis after this year? Is Keely Ringo going to be the number 2 for you? But just draft good football players, Howie. That's what we're asking you to do. And
for sure,
there's been some times, Lou, and since he's regained power here, that he's put together some classes that are still paying dividends for this team.
I think so too, and that's what we're going to get into coming up next right here on Locked On Eagles. It's kind of our initial reaction show, so I want to take a trip down memory lane for Gino and I since we've been doing this show together back in 2017 and 2018. What were our favorite draft classes on paper? Doesn't mean they worked out, but right after the draft, what were our favorite classes? We'll get into that coming up next right here on the Locked On Eagles podcast.
As we roll along on LOE, this episode is brought to you by our friends over at GameTime. Right now, folks, baseball is the thing. Right now, the sun is out here in Denver. Tickets for Colorado Rockies games it's inexplicable how cheap they are. Me and the wife are talking about going to so many games this summer, sit out on the deck, and I've been on my GameTime app for quite literally 2 hours today. And there's been times where I've gone to other ticket sites, gone through third parties, and I've spent money and I didn't end up with a ticket. And unfortunately, that hasn't happened since I went to GameTime. And it will be the one move that I guarantee you make that you will not regret. And you're probably saying, Gino, why do I have to go to GameTime? Well, they have flash deals, zone deals, all in pricing, seat views, right from the menu. You get a panoramic view from the app right before you buy, the lowest price guarantee, or they will credit you 110% of the difference if you price match somewhere else. So today, take the guesswork out of buying tickets with GameTime. Download the GameTime app, create an account, use code LOCKEDONNFL for $20 off your first purchase. Once again, terms apply. Create an account and redeem code LOCKEDONNFL. That's LOCKEDON NFL for $20 off. Download GameTime app today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed.
All right, Gino, so today we've been talking a lot about initial reactions, what we would like about the first pick, especially for the Eagles on day one, what we would react in a negative way towards. And I think when you look at the drafts we've covered together, I don't know, it's been mostly positive. I think we've been pretty happy with the class on paper, even though a lot of them have not worked out. Mm-hmm. What was right after the draft, what was the draft that you just look on paper? You know how like when you do a fantasy draft growing up and it just went your way. Sometimes fantasy drafts don't. You're like, I can't believe I got all these guys. And you're just admiring your team after the draft. What was that night? Which night was like that for you for the Eagles at the end of the draft?
There's been some ugly ones where
Let's remove 2016 because that was a quarterback-driven one, which obviously carried so much more unique weight. So like 2017 and up.
I think 2017. I mean, outside of the very
Sid?
first pick with Sidney Jones, I thought I was like, oh, we got our premier cornerback, and they double up with Rasul Douglas. I'm like, oh, one of these guys is gonna work out, and it's like, oh, we did the thing for the first time in nearly 15 years since the Lito Shepherd draft.
Yeah,
and neither of those guys worked out for us.
For the Eagles, yeah, I'll say Zool's been doing well outside of
it. Good on him.
You know what's funny is the first live show we had for the draft together, 2019 might have been, when you look at the pick in a vacuum of Andre Dillard or the pick in a vacuum of J.J. Arcega-Whiteside, those weren't like my preferred prospects for that draft. But I will say it just felt like I loved the idea of what they were doing. It felt like at the time they were going all in on supporting Carson Wentz by going with an offensive tackle, a running back in Miles Sanders. You guys know that year I would not shut up about running back on this podcast. They took Miles Sanders. They took a receiver in the second round. It was like, yes, they are building around their quarterback, and I loved that idea. Of course, the execution did not fit the philosophy, but I really, like, after that class, I'm like, this is great. Like, 2019 was exciting. You got a tackle, running back, receiver. On paper, it was definitely fun to, imagine what that offense could have been like. It didn't work, but I think 2019 was pretty exciting.
Day 2 of 2019 was great because you got those picks back to back.
Right. A running back and a receiver. I mean, every fan's going to like that.
You loved Miles in that class.
Loved him.
I loved JJ in that class. We were both so happy.
Yeah. It was a very positive,
didn't work out.
Positive
did
episode.
Not work out, that's for sure.
I think last year too, Gino, like we couldn't believe the job they did. Where we thought Nolan Smith was going to be someone we were okay with that first pick. That ends up being Jalen Carter. And then, I liked the Tyler Steen pick. Sidney Brown, I didn't think was going to be available in the third round. Then you get Keely Ringo on day 3 and DeAndre Swift you make a trade for. Last year on paper was pretty great too.
If we're including trades, then I think you have to include
then
AJ Brown,
right?
For sure. But no, last year I was literally maniacally laughing at the fact that we were joking like, oh, there's no way the league lets them get Jalen Carter, right? Oh, there's no way they're actually going to let them get Jalen Carter. And they have Jalen Carter, and he's as good as freaking advertised, folks. Like, the kid is unbelievable, and I still chuckle about it. And the Nolan Smith thing, and then you're like, oh, Keely Ringo, Alex Clancy traded up in our NFL mock draft to get back into the first round to get Keely Ringo, and we get him in the 4th. So there's all
right. We thought he was a day 1, late day 1, early day 2 pick, and they traded up in the 4th round again.
That's why reactions, like, you got to take a step back and be like, oh, why did that happen? Like, oh, why did he fall? And I think there's some times when we've been on the wrong end of it, and times 2020, we were completely on the wrong end
first
of
2
everything,
picks.
man. And in
actually all of them, because I love the Davian Taylor selection too. And was Kevon Wallace in that class?
Yes, yeah.
So that whole draft I loved. And
it was the one pick that was kind of known that they were in love with this guy before the draft. And we were like, oh, they're going to take him at some point. And the safety class, I loved every safety in that class, and they end up with Kevon Wallace.
That might have been our worst draft the way we looked coming out of that one.
And now Jalen Hurts is your only saving grace, man. Yeah. And it's like,
tough.
Thank goodness you got that guy, right?
Isn't that insane that of all of the picks in that draft, the only one that, like you said, is a saving grace is the one that the entire city destroyed them for and again at the time justifiably so, but that's the crazy part of the NFL draft, but that's why it's so fun. And I think it's still great to react like that, Gino, because you can't not react out of fear that it's not going to work out.
100%. But I mean, if we're going to take a look at what is the best class since we've been doing this, 2018, which had the least amount of picks. My God, absolutely
crushed
every single pick.
Even the worst pick was Matt Pryor, and he was an okay backup for a few years. Like, that wasn't a complete bust.
Didn't they get a compensatory pick for him?
I believe so, yeah. He ended up starting for the Colts, if I'm not mistaken, with Frank Reich.
You walk away, that was the Dallas Goedert draft.
Dallas Goedert, it was Josh Sweat, Avonte Maddox, Jordan Mailata, just loaded.
Absolutely loaded. And I've said this quote multiple times on this show. I remember vividly watching the ESPN draft coverage and Todd McShay saying, you're going to look back on this 4th round and look at Josh Sweat and say the Philadelphia Eagles got a steal here. And who would have thought that between Hassan Reddick and Josh Sweat is the guy that Howie Roseman ended up choosing, and go back to getting a guy in the 4th round who had knee issues And all of a sudden, he turns out to be great. So that's why you can't shy away from guys.
It's true. Sometimes the drafts with the least amount of excitement, Gino, are the best ones. You draft a
guy who played freaking rugby, never played football before, and you draft Avonte Maddox at cornerback, who's as tall as me, and I'm 5'8", and you draft a tight end out of South Dakota State. Those are the type of drafts that you got to look back and kind of just giggle at too, because we were all wrong on probably all of those picks. And I wanted Sony Michel at the end of that round.
So did I, man. And we were all on the Sony Michel train.
And that's why Howie Roseman has his job. And
that's why I'm doing this and not a general manager.
That's why I'm only an assistant director, player person.
That's right.
Yes.
All right, guys, that's going to do it for today's edition of the Locked On Eagles podcast. 3 more shows for you this week. We thank you so much for making Locked On Eagles your first listen each and every day. For Gino Camilleri, I'm Lou DiBiase signing off. As always, thanks so much for downloading, watching, and listening, and let's go Birds.
Fly, Eagles, fly.